immediately hand over to Felix Lee, who has accepted to moderate in the first session. Yeah, we are in the midst of the topic, also Germany, China, the German challenge. Please.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Adam, for this. I would call it the Manifesto 1.2 after the Berlin Declaration from last year. In the next panel, we are going to talk about or getting deeper into the China shock and which is especially a big challenge for Germany. Or a lot of economists call it the second China shock. We will get deeper what was the first China shock and also talk about what's happening is the second China shock that threatens especially Germany's industrial backbone. China's state-sponsored export offensive is hitting key sectors such as the automobiles, mechanical engineering, and green technology. And at the same time, Germany and probably Europe are in danger of missing out on new key technologies such as batteries, AI, semiconductors, robotics. This is what we're going to talk about, how to overcome this China shock. And I would welcome to the podium Servaas Storm and Brad Setzer, Dalia Marin and Margarita Russo. Please join us, or maybe you sit here in the middle and I sit at the side. Yes, please. To give a brief introduction, I start with Dalia Marin. Dalia Marin, you are Professor of International Economics at the Technical University TU Munich and Senior Research Fellow at Bruegel. Welcome, Dalia. And next is Margarita Russo, Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Modena and specializing in the analysis of innovation and the automotive industry. Welcome. Margarita, your research includes comparative studies on the digital transformation of automotive supply chains, notably comparing China, Germany, Japan, and Italy. And Brad Setzer, is it pronounced proper? Setzer is you're international economist at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former staff economist at the United States Department of the Treasury. You also worked at Rubini Global Economics Monitor as Director of Global Research, where you were the co-author of the book Bailouts or Bail-ins. And Servaas Storm, economist at Delft University of Technology and editor on board of the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies. You contributed to analysis on China's economic development, particularly regarding the impact of infrastructure investments, such as roads, railways, and ports, how this has driven regional economic growth on China. Welcome. We start with a few presentation, and I think we should start with you, Dalia, please.
Can I have the slides up? Oh, thank you. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is to show you that the China shock has hit Germany. It started in 2020. So this is a historic shift, Germany's trade with China. Here are the numbers. So the darker line shows imports from China to Germany. And as you can see, the imports exploded since 2020. This explosion, so it was an increase within 2 years of 30%. That stopped because of two reasons. The first reason was that Germany removed the subsidy for purchasing electric vehicles, which basically was a subsidy for Chinese electric vehicle imports. And then during 2024, the European Commission introduced import tariffs on electric vehicles up to 45%, and that also contributed to this decline. At the same time, the light line shows exports to China, and they also declined substantially. So this can be seen much better in these import-export shares, where you see that since 2020, the import share has increased by the import share, which measures imports imports from China in total imports, which increased by 30%, and the export share to China declined also by 30%. So what was driving this pattern? And basically, this pattern was driven by two sectors, which is the car industry and machinery trade. So in the upper panel, you can see the car industry. And what this shows is the red line gives you the exports from Germany to China of cars. And what you see here is that they declined by 75%. So exports of cars declined by 75%, while the imports increased by 30%. That's the blue line. So basically what you see in the car industry is that Germany stopped to be a net exporter of cars to China. The bottom line of the panel shows you the machinery sector. And in the machinery sector, which is quite stark, the blue line gives you imports of machinery from China to Germany. And what you see basically is that Germany stopped to be a net exporter of machinery to China since the year 2014. I hope you see this. Since the year 2014. So remember, Germany was the main driver of industrialization in China by exporting its machinery tools to China. So that picture has completely turned. This summarizes what I just said. So Germany faces the threat of losing two of its core sectors, like Nokia. Finland lost vis-à-vis the US with Nokia versus Apple. So the tables have turned now. China is the world leader in batteries and electric vehicles, and Germany was the world leader in the internal combustion engine. China's size, its experience, and subsidies helped the learning in China and the learning to scale up production in batteries. Now, in a famous, or maybe a classic paper, Krugman introduced learning curves into international trade models, and what he shows is that past output determines current production. So what he shows is that a transitory subsidy can speed up the learning curve, putting competitors at a permanent disadvantage. And that has been shown empirically by Nathan Lane in 2021 for South Korea. So China became the dominant car maker in China, as you can see in this graph, and that started in 2020. A peculiar feature is that China, in spite of the fact that China is the world leader in batteries, when you look at the announced gigafactories in batteries in Europe, you see almost 50% of these batteries are done among European firms. Now, that suggests that there is a problem here. And the reason why there is a problem is look at the early failures that we have been observing. The most spectacular was the Swedish gigafactory Northvolt, which went bankrupt in 2025. And that was Europe's big hope in battery manufacturing, and they filed for bankruptcy. Another very important battery producer, European battery producer, is the firm ACC. This is it's called the Airbus of batteries, and it's a joint venture between Mercedes, Stellantis, and Total Energy. And they have started to produce batteries, but their initial scrapping rate of batteries was 90% at the start. So what they have been experiencing is a valley of death until the batteries become profitable, and they are not yet profitable either. And so ACC put the 2 gigafactories that they planned for Germany and Italy on hold. So both of these experiences show that there is a big problem of scaling up production of battery production. So batteries is not a simple technology. It's very advanced, and it takes time to learn, and it takes time, experience to get them to do them profitable. Because usually in Germany they say this is just mid-tech. It's not mid-tech. It's a sophisticated technology. My question that I now pose is, what can Germany do given this substantial threat? So first of all, Europe should avoid America's painful deindustrialization in the 2000s after the first China shock. And what Europe needs to do is it needs to partner with China to speed up learning the battery technology. Instead of doing a startup, as yesterday Minister Weizsäcker was suggesting, you're not doing a startup by doing batteries, but what you should do is you partner with the Chinese. They are already the world experts, and so you can skip the startup phase by moving right into the profitability zone. So 2 years ago, I suggested that what Europe should do. I produced 2 Project Syndicate columns in which I suggested that Germany and Europe should reverse engineer the China industrial policy to make, so Europe should make Chinese market access to the European market contingent on forming joint ventures with European firms. And Europe followed my advice. In 2024, December 2024, they introduced the European Action Plan. And in this action plan, the European Union demands technology transfer from Chinese companies. So I'm running out of time, so I can't describe what they are doing. But let me focus on one thing, and I think we should frame our discussion on that. So how do you make sure that the technology transfer is going to take place? And it boils down to the way you design these joint venture contracts. The problem is that the Chinese government urged Chinese investors in Europe to produce only the latest stage of production. And here is the danger that there is no technology transfer, and that Europe becomes just putting the things together, but not any skill. So therefore, I suggest we should do these joint venture contracts in a 50-50 ownership share between European and Chinese partners, so it should be on the same level. And at the same time, Europe should recruit in these firms, in these joint ventures, skilled Chinese professionals who can teach the Europeans how to do these batteries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalia Marin. nice to hear that Brussels heard your advice. I'm not so sure if Wolfsburg Volkswagen have recognized your advice, because I think this takes a big mentality change, needs a big mentality change to invite the Chinese over to take over Osnabrück factory and learn from the Chinese and being the student and not the teacher anymore.
So
I think
this is exactly what the Germans have to learn, to be less arrogant. To be less arrogant.
We will go deeper into this. Before I want to hand over to Servaas and also Margarita, I would like to ask Brad Zetze about we were talking about the first China shock before, which happened in the beginning of the 2000s, which hit the US very hard. Maybe if you give a very, very short introduction, what happened, what mistakes were made by the US, and to what the extent are the consequences still being felt today? Maybe Adam also wants to add some.
Well, I was actually excited to talk about Germany.
We will.
The simple description of the first China shock is that as part of a global acceleration after China's WTO entry in China's global trade surplus of about a percentage point of world GDP in manufacturing. So let me first clarify. There are two China shocks that happen after China's WTO entry. One is in manufacturing, and it is broadly negative for lower and mid-tech manufacturing sectors in all the advanced economies. There is another China shock, which was a commodity price shock, that was very positive for many emerging and developing economies, but it also squeezed real incomes in the working class in the advanced economies. Those are two related shocks. They're linked to an acceleration in China's growth, and they're linked to an unbalanced pattern of growth. China's surplus goes up. China's exports grow much more rapidly than its imports, particularly of manufacturers. And in the US, there's roughly a percentage point increase in the trade deficit in manufacturers with China, which almost perfectly corresponds to a reduction of equal size in manufacturing output in the US. And the China shock is the impact that shift has not on the overall economy, but on those parts of the economy that were most exposed to Chinese competition. And the central insight of the Otto Dorn and Hansen paper was that in those regional economies, there were consistently bad labor market outcomes for the workers who were directly affected, but then also for the workers who competed with them. And that the general story for those regions was not of successful adjustment into new industries. It was some modest amount of outmigration, but much less than we in the US expected. We thought we had these wonderful, perfectly flexible labor markets, so a shock to one part of the country had no meaningful impact because people would move to expanding parts of the country. That doesn't turn out to be true. And then you see more people falling into poverty traps, going on Social Security, disability, and the like. There was, you can argue, this coincided with another China shock, which was a positive China shock for Germany. This is when China's industrial expansion leads to increased demand for German machinery, and this is when Chinese entrepreneurs become wealthy enough that they can afford an Audi. What did the US, in my view, get wrong? I think the US misjudged the severity of the China shock, didn't do enough to help people who were adversely affected. Politically, the US took a view, and this is, I think, with hindsight extraordinary, that the special safeguards that were introduced as part of the WTO entry, which allowed, in response to import surges, protectionist measures to try to limit the surge, to allow more time for adjustment. The US, under the Bush administration, took the view that they would not use these special protections. And so the US, in a broad sense, did nothing in response to the first China shock. We were distracted by the Iraq War. We had an ideology that was, at that point, extremely liberal. We did not use the safeguards we had negotiated. And then we did not challenge, in an effective way, a very obvious at the time undervaluation of China's currency. And so that was allowed to persist, and China's surplus kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger up until the global financial crisis shock. So, I think the bigger observation was that the US at the time, the dominant political discourse, was maybe too wed to the notion that the US economy could just become a bigger extended version of the company Apple. That all the US needed to do was have the design, have the software, have the profits, which the Chinese sort of resented, and that there was no important or strategic component to manufacturing. And I think in a grand sense, the US has been living with the consequences of that broad consensus, and it's unraveling.
Adam?
I think it's perhaps also worth saying that, though Brad has brilliantly summarized the intricacies of the China shock literature, the overall effect in relation to the grander scheme of a US labor market of 170 million people is small. So part of the insouciance, part of the obliviousness to the shock was the impacts are local and they're quantitatively small. And so there was this idea it all wash out in the broader scheme of things, and other sectors in the US economy, notably the high-value service sector, would profit handsomely from business with China. I would just want to add, so that we can connect up the dots and link this to broader themes also of our concerns here. I mean, there's another China shock, and perhaps historically the most momentous is, after all, the ecological shock. So China's accelerated growth in the early 2000s blows out the climate politics of the 1990s, because China's emissions surge at a rate never before seen in history. And that induces a crisis in China, which links up precisely to the industrial policy themes, because from the mid-2000s onwards, also under the impression of the American invasion of Iraq, the Chinese are asking themselves very serious questions about the sustainability of this growth model. And one of the conclusions they reach, both for national security reasons, tech advantage, and also immediate the ecology of pollution, is they need to start thinking very seriously about new energy systems. And by the 2010s, with the help also of German subsidies, this is really playing through into the dominance that we saw. So you can hook these things up. And in terms of the decision-making in Beijing, it's not an entirely straight line, but the agenda is shifted by the China shock. And before we get any misunderstandings, 85% of that ecological shock in China is not export-driven, but domestic growth. It's steel and cement being poured to urbanize 500 million people in the space of a single generation. Triggers for that multiplier effects are coming from the export sector, but broadly speaking, it's a domestic global growth. But that is a key element. The renewable energy spin-offs are a reaction, a long-range reaction to that initial realization that China is going to change the global energy equation. You see it in energy markets, commodity prices, you see it in just unprecedented levels of pollution, and you see it in this technological window that opens, which they've charged through. Well, we slept in Europe on the automotive front anyway.
So at least for a short time, we exported our pollution to China.
Yes, we did, but one should never conflate, and this is an order of magnitudes thing, the fact that that's a big element in the European equation with the claim that that's a big element in the Chinese equation, right? Because it can show up as about a quarter of the European decarbonization is achieved through export in this period, right? But that doesn't mean that it's anywhere near that share of China's growth, because they double steel output in 12 years. They pour more cement in 3 years than the United States in the 20th century, and that's not for export.
Servaas, let's get back to Central Europe. We're talking about the second China shock now, but looking back from previous trade challenges for Germany, how does it distinguish, or is it different or is it more severe than previous crises, which always happened in the history of European history?
Is it
Economy, sorry.
Yeah, it's working. This, yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. The question is also, let's say, historically important. I mean, if we make a distinction, let's say, simply between the first China shock and the second China shock, then other European countries, let's focus on Italy for a moment, were hit first. Yeah, and deindustrialization in Italy and all the problems in Italy are partly explainable by looking at that first shock. And of course, then the financial crisis hit, and Italy and Southern Europe as a whole became a problematic peripheral area. And the Germans were, of course, not, and the Dutch. I am Dutch, so I have to include the Dutch as well, because the Dutch were almost as worse, maybe even worse than the Germans. So the northwestern European response was, look, Italy, Greece, Spain, this is all your fault, it's your mistake. Yeah? And now, I think in the US they say the chickens have come home to roost. That is, Germany is hit. In higher technology, like initially it was simple, let's say low tech, medium tech, textiles, all kinds of steel products, electronic products hit by China. The European producers were hit, and now it's high tech, medium high tech, cars, and even let's say think of AI and solar panels and batteries and so on. So what it would mean to me is that Germany, the Netherlands, do now eat humble pie. Yeah, I think that is sort of yeah. We are all in this together, and solutions also probably have to be worked out at the European level. And it's no longer we can talk about Italians or Greek being overspending money and thrifty, austere Northwestern Europeans doing all things correctly. Yeah, it's now clear that this is bigger.
You also prepared a short presentation.
Yes. If I can have the. Yes. Well, to be honest, I'm not a great slide producer, and it's also true that the problem team is so large that of course I overloaded my slides. Yeah, so I'm not really going to. I will. Don't worry. I'm not going to sort of.
I'm looking at the watch.
Yeah, I'm not going to guide you through each one of these things. I will. If you, I mean, maybe we can do two. You can, as an audience, you can do two things simultaneously, like multitasking. Try to read this, and I will sort of give the meta story somehow. The meta story is, okay, Adam Tooze is also known for coining the term polycrisis. We can say multiple shocks, multiple challenges. I even forgot very stupidly to include Trump's tariffs, which would, it also doesn't fit. Yeah, so we have so many things. Yeah, there's the China shock. There's bond markets that are very volatile. There is exploitation by the tech brothers. There is cheap Russian gas is gone, and we are now paying very high prices for LNG, American LNG. There's the whole defense issue, and at the back of all this, there is global warming. Short-term problems are becoming so pressing that we do again, let's say, cognitive dissonance. We adjust, say, the problem. Yeah. Anyway, we look at it later. Yeah. I said, okay, what are sort of the policy responses? And I will not go through the list, but the basic idea is deregulation, cutting wages. Of course, we have to joint ventures with China, try to sort of do the reverse thing to the technological leaders nowadays. That's all fine, but I do think that, and as far as demand side policies go. It's mostly defense spending. Yeah, all of a sudden, we are Rheinmetall is going to have a bonanza. Yeah, but that does it solve our problems? Yeah, that is the question. And I think that for each of these problems, and again, I will not go through the list, but I do think that there are more sensible solutions. Yeah, we can try to regulate the tech platforms. Don't be afraid. We can try to build European alternatives, going to be very long term. We have to keep a focus on the green transition, climate change. If there's one thing we can learn from China, and it's really extremely important, that is directional thrust to what governments do. Yeah, this is development planning. It's very old-fashioned. Planning has become a dirty word in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Actually, I studied development planning in Erasmus University. And of course, over time, that name had to be changed. Yeah, that department no longer exists. Yeah. But I do think that industrial policy is part of this. So there is a need for a revival of planning. Yeah, corporations, by the way, do a lot of planning. Yeah, so it's only governments that are not allowed to plan. Taxation is a big issue. There's a crisis of the fiscal state. We cannot tax. Yeah, or we think we cannot tax. And in most European countries, the income taxation is no longer progressive. In the Netherlands, it's almost Scandinavia, huh? Netherlands, not progressive taxation, the income tax system. Corporate taxation, there's tax competition, race to the bottom, whatever. But so, I think importantly, demand has to go up. That's Europe's weakest spot. That means spending, public investment, which is going to crowd in private spending, private investment. And we also have to think about higher wages. Oh, look, how is this possible? That is actually the next slide. Hey, people, we are in a market economy. We are facing all these constraints. All these things are not possible, or are they? Okay, I mean, I'm not saying that they are all possible at the same time. I just want to raise the questions, yeah? Can we raise wages? Yes, no, why not? How important are unit labor costs for international competitiveness? In my view, grossly overstated importance. Yeah, Germany is now losing export shares or export volumes, not because high wages in Germany. It is because they've betted on the wrong technology. Yeah, everything is wrong. Why is everything wrong? For instance, in the car industry, because up to 2024, 2023, car profits in the car manufacturing sector have never been so high. The Porsche Pierre family has had a great time between 2008 2023. I calculated for Volkswagen in real terms, constant prices, dividend payouts per car produced globally. Yeah, not in Germany, including the cars in China. Dividend payments go up, straight line, up to 2023. Yeah. Then we talk about wages. Of course, we can talk about wages. I mean, this is like polder model we have in the Netherlands. So it's like give and take between employers and employees and government. All fine, but why not raise wages? Yeah, we get monetary policy. Paul de Grauwe made a very clear point about how we are actually subsidizing banks, billions of euros per year. That money would finance half or more of the green transition. We are not doing it. Regulation of tech firms, yes. It's not possible. Nothing is possible. Yeah. Whole point is these tech firms are basically using public money for for privatized profits. Yeah. There's regulation can actually be technology forcing. Yeah. Goethe said, "In der Beschränkung zeigt sich der Meister." Yeah. So let's beschränk. Yeah. Impose rules. Yeah. Bond markets are celebrated because governments are not rational. So we have supposedly rational bond markets imposing market discipline on unruly governments. Point is, bond markets are completely fragile, crazy, irrational. It's a casino. We are actually supporting this. Yeah, it's like that's socialism for the rich. The central banks are backstopping whatever financial speculation there is. And it's, as I write there, heads I win, tails you lose. So it's, yeah. Why not have more fiscal policy? Why not have monetary policy support fiscal policy? Answers, yeah, no, it's not possible. Like it's our thinking. Yeah, that's what I want to emphasize. So what we need is a change in thinking. whatever we call it, not captured by vested interest or financial power or whatever, sort of celebrating markets for things that markets do not do. We can actually have die Beschränkung, we can have rules, regulation. We, very importantly, John Kenneth Galbraith, known for like in the type of economies with monopolies, oligopolies that we have, we need countervailing power. Do we have it? No, we don't. Policy autonomy is probably the key value that we need in Europe, that is sovereignty. Can we decide how we organize our economies? Do we want to copy-paste the American model, venture capital, go with all the deregulation, all the inequality, all the polarization, and at the end of the day get a European Trump? I'm not sure, what the name would be, but there are candidates already. The other thing, of course, is climate change. Like, okay, we can say, look, we are not going, we stick with the famous ostrich attitude. We stick our head into the sand and ignore it. I work in the University of Technology. I can tell you climate damage functions, the things are happening. The thing is happening. It is simply completely stupid to not pay serious attention to it. At the end of the day, creating a better, fairer society, and I'm not prescribing, I'm not saying, look, I know what it should be. That's not the idea. The idea is that we talk about this amongst ourselves. We have autonomy, we can design and change institutions and do things. That would be the answer to a lot of anxiety and also anger, and it could be an antidote to, let's say, far-right populism. I want to finish with a quote by John Maynard Keynes, who said, and of course it's a simplified slogan, but I do think that in principle it is correct, that is anything we can actually do, we can afford. That would be a good starting point. And then the question is, how are we going to organize our economy, our society in Europe and in Germany in order to create the economy, but also larger the society that we want. And affording it is not unimportant, but you could say it's a secondary issue. First we have to be clear about how are we going to do it now, and then we have all the the geopolitical problems, and there's war, and maybe the war is going to escalate, and maybe we get I don't know what. That's true, but I do think, so I agree with Adam that this moment, of course, is also, let's say, fluid, horrendous. It's like you feel helpless. But at the same time, it's also clear that the order that was there before has collapsed. We have, we will, by default, we will get something in its place. And the question is, okay, Europe is large enough to think about autonomy, some sovereignty, some creativity as well, and that means we have to rethink our economics. That was.
Thank you. I see just one point. What you're saying with the fiscal problems, a lot of Western mid-sized economies I think have turned out to be major political crises. We see so many governments have collapsed in the last years, and I wonder if it has something to do that the two superpowers, China and US, are competing so heavily that all the other countries, and we're not only talking about Germany, we're not only talking about Italy, but also about South Korea, Japan, that all these countries cannot keep up. We get back to this question a little bit later, because I want to give Margarita also the chance that you have prepared. You are focusing on automotive industry, which and you did comparable studies. For Italians and for the Germans, the car industry so far was so important.
Well, I would start from a simple point, linking my presentation to what Dalia was saying with respect to the learning process that was mentioned with respect to development. And in my understanding of the automotive industries, this is the most incredible part of a story in which learning was not implemented. In the sense that if you consider the expansion that we were observing in Daria's slide of export of Germany to China, and in particular, you should consider the growth of Chinese internal market, you had to consider the importance of German producers. At the very beginning, when the Chinese economy was open to the market economy, the German government was there saying, we are here to support you. And I was really always being impressed by that part of the story. So the German government was there, bringing the most important German companies in China directly, with starting important joint ventures. And when you visit the Volkswagen plant in Shanghai, you are told exactly that story. We are here because the German government helped us, and we are here at this level of development because we learned a lot from German companies. So my point is, what did the German companies learn from the Chinese companies in the 40 years in which they were installed in that economy? They could have an important part of learning, for example, in what is the meaning of scaling up of new production, and they didn't use that learning. They didn't use that at all. And in my presentation, I will show you that they had their own potential. I don't know how to move, just next. Okay, so my presentation is on navigating the disruption, okay? And the disruption on the automotive industry. And the point is that when we consider the transition to the electric vehicle, we have to consider that this is not a mature technology. This is a technology that is challenged every moment by new knowledge in completely separate different domains, from chemical to electronic control to sensoring. So you need to embrace a lot of technologies. And I start from this figure. I will not consider all the interactions in the many dimensions that you have to address when you study the transition to electric vehicle. And I will focus only on a very tiny part, but essential for my argument, that is the focus on technological knowledge, and I try to measure it using a pattern activity. So I'm not considering the production that was to some extent very well described when we observed the trends that Dalia was showing us with regard to machinery, production, and cars. So I will consider some figures to address the issue, what is the technological potential of the leading automotive countries? And these countries are well known, Germany, Japan, the US, Germany, Korea, and China are the most important one at present. So I will use figures on technology domains that are relevant in the automotive industry. I will use a pattern dynamics, and I will present a cross-country comparison in the period 2010-2021, but will observe some changes in some periods. I will consider groups of, macro groups of patterns. So let's have a look to the upper figures where we saw the overall dynamic that was stable in a long period, 2010-2019, I would say. Then there is a decline. But if we see the macro groups, we see that battery was having a larger increase, and obviously there was a sharp decrease of all the patterns related to the internal combustion engine, what is called the YIC. But also electric vehicle was a large part of the increase. But the entire control system is an important part of the development of these technologies. The patterns with respect to motor were not very relevant and to some extent declining at some point. Now, what happens when we consider the countries and we consider the countries with all the types of patterns, the patterns in all domains we consider. So Japan is the strongest producer of patents. Then we have US and Germany. equal weight, Korea, China, France, and so on. But if you had a look at the sub-periods in the slide below, in the figure below, you had different dynamics by sub-period. And let's focus on the first 5 countries, so from Japan to China, and we see the sharp increase in China in the last sub-period, but sharp decrease in Japan, good level of patents in the US and in Germany. Korea was increasing the number of patents, but now can we discuss some elements to assess the technological potential of countries, and then consider 3 dimensions. The first one is cross-country collaboration. The second one is the quantity of patents, and then the quality of patents. Why do I start from cross-country collaboration? Because this research project started by my idea that because of mutual learning, we could find a lot of patents that were, to some extent, originated by the Chinese and German collaboration, because there was an incredible potential they had at hand, but they didn't absolutely explore. You can say, well, but it's obvious, a patent is exactly what is done to protect intellectual property. So you defend your domain of knowledge. But this is not a story of a market economy in which companies try to have a better position in the long term. This is not the story that they were telling us when they were explaining the importance of open innovation, the importance of entering new fields with strong collaboration of countries. So all the narrative on open innovation, for example, is a narrative absolutely absurd in this context, just a way to distract attention on what was going on. So let's see what is cross-country collaboration. Just nothing. You can't barely see the orange part of the bar. Nothing, more than nothing. Because countries prioritize domestic innovation capabilities. You can say, well, it is obvious. But what happens when we consider the quantity of patent? And we see that there is quite a difference when we consider battery and internal electric vehicles. So Germany has a better performance than China, while China has a better performance in terms of number of patents with respect to entire vehicle control systems. So we see differences in the sub-periods and differences in the subdomains. So Germany is keeping the point, I can say, and keeping the point in some relevant domains of the technologies. Now we see the impact of quality of patents. This is a quite basic box plot in which we see the fact that if we consider the 3 main domains in which differences are relevant, battery, electrical vehicles, and entire vehicle controlling system, we see the dot line at the middle of the image, and this is the median, the overall median. So you can see the various boxes where locate the position of countries. Well, does the quality matter more than quantity? Well, we can say that Germany has more patents than China in battery and electrical vehicles, but median of quality is lower. Can we say that what is the position of China? Well, with regard to the entire control system, not only they have more patents than Germany, but they have also higher quality. But be attentive on the fact that we have the US and Korea that have an important and significant position in quality. Now, let me consider 3 key insights that, according to me, are crucial with innovation and industrial policy. First of all, technological sovereignty is emerging as a central focus in the transition. Then we have cross-country differences in patent quantity that might reflect divergent technology priorities of the countries and their competence networks that are different. Then we have domains, key domains, in which quantity and quality of patents do not align, and the US seems to lead in quality. So the point is that what is the result? Why don't we find an alignment of and I would say an abstract definition of quality? I use the standard from OECD data, and the details of the paper can be asked if we are interested. But from the details, we see that something else is relevant, and is the connection between the innovation policy, and in particular the patent policy of the country, and their ability to transform technological knowledge in business models able to set the position of the companies in a way in which not only they have profits, as you mentioned, he mentioned for Volkswagen and German companies that had incredible profits until 2023, but to transform those companies in real pure marketing companies in which they do not protect simply their current position, the current position of their management, but they are to some extent the drivers of their economies. They are no longer the drivers of their economies. They were unable, those companies, to understand the changes that were overcoming them, and they were unable to set strategies able to keep their companies and the companies and the countries that were funding them to a better position in the new global scenario. So the industrial policy should consider Germany or the EU in technology leadership, because if we consider figures for European Union at 27, figures show that the number of patents of European countries lead the classification. So altogether, the 27 has more patents than the US. But the point is that is the technology lead enough for the future of innovation? Business models and strategies of countries become an essential part, according to me, of the story for the future.
Thank you very much. What's so shocking is the speed of development which is happening technology-wise in China. And I remember, I mean, on the other hand, it's not surprising, because I remember when Deng Xiaoping invited all the Western car companies to China in the beginning of the 1980s, it was always this goal: we invite them to learn from them, and when we have learned everything, we kick them out. This never happened as long as there was, a lot of trying, a lot of copying. It never worked out with combustion engine. And I remember 2010. It was the Minister of Technology, Wang Gang. He studied in Clausthal-Zellerfeld in Germany. He said, "Okay, we cannot keep up on combustion. Then we start a new technology." And then when it started with the e-mobility transition, Brett.
But
yes, sorry.
A key issue is whether the Chinese, they invited the German car companies to come to China. Now the tables have turned, and the question is, will the Chinese share their knowledge with the German companies? Will they do? Because so far, the Chinese government has said, it's fine if you invest in Europe to circumvent the tariffs that the European Commission has imposed, but please only produce the latest stage of the production process, which means that Europe will be simply as an assembly line. Mm-hmm. So that is the key question. How do you get the Chinese into the boat in a cooperative framework? This is the key question.
And then we're back with the mentality in Wolfsburg and Munich and Ingolstadt. I'm not so sure if this has already arrived, the thinking. Brett, you wanted to talk about Germany. How how can we learn, maybe not only learn from what happened in the US 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but what is your advice for Germany, how to respond to the China shock which is happening at the moment?
Well, every automotive power and every machinery, I mean, I like the German term mechanical engineering. I think we, in English, we don't have as good as a descriptor of the sector as the mechanical engineering sector. But every one of the traditional leaders in these sectors is profoundly challenged, both by the technological change and by the fact that China's position on the cost curve is quite different. So I would give 3 broad pieces of advice to Germany and to Europe. The first piece of advice would be don't cling ferociously to the past. I think Servaas highlighted that in the past, Europe sometimes thought it could compete, and Germany often thought it could compete, and the Netherlands even more so, with a strategy of wage restraint and then relying on other countries' profligacy and spending to generate the demand that powers the productive side of the economy. That did work for a while. Germany did incredibly well selling luxury cars to the US and to China. But I think you can reasonably surmise that the German exports to the US are on a downward trajectory. And it is quite clear that German exports to China are on a sharp downward trajectory. They were 2.5% of GDP, German GDP, a couple of years ago. They're now 2% of GDP. I think in a couple of years, they'll be 1% of GDP, German GDP, which would be consistent with the rest of the EU. Germany's becoming a normal European economy that is only going to get a percentage point of demand from China, while generating much more demand for China. And I'm not sure there is a set of German policies that can fundamentally change that. When China joined the WTO, and if you exclude imports of parts, mostly chips, imports of manufacturers were about 8% of China's economy. They're now down to under 3% of China's economy after 20 years of WTO membership. This is deeply entrenched import substitution, and it is a clear policy of Xi. Don't think that you can change that. Don't think Mercedes can be, by being nice to China in inter-European debates, change what is a core tenet of Xi Jinping's policy. Second piece of advice, embrace industrial policy. Now, that's easy for an American to say, I guess. Maybe it's hard for an American to say because our president now seems to think tariffs are a full and perfect substitute for industrial policy. Industrial policy has a lot of different components. Some of it is addressing strategic dependencies where other countries can weaponize supply chains against your home country, home market. The West, if there is a West, the US unilaterally certainly have weaponized supply chains at times against China, but China's learned, and it seems to me essential that in those sectors, and the hard part is identifying the sectors, where a critical input, if denied, can shut down a whole industry, that you would assure diversity of supply through government policy, even if that means not relying on entirely commercial logic. For rare earths, you just need them. Right? You don't need companies in those sectors that make profits. You just need to assure supply. And then more generally with the green transition, I will I will proudly embrace some of the innovations of the previous US administration. I do think that a green transition, in order to be politically palatable, has to have a distributional set of considerations, so not all the costs are borne by the consumers, and that there are needs to induce shifts in technology. And I would frankly be very, one might say, Chinese in initially focusing those efforts on European companies and European production, allowing scope for Chinese companies to come to Europe. I believe, controversially, that Europe should embrace a 25% across-the-board tariff on autos vis-a-vis China. That has the advantage of being fully symmetric. That is the Chinese auto tariff until they unilaterally reduced it. And I think it was a mistake, frankly, to follow WTO rules so precisely that Tesla and BYD ended up with lower tariffs than VW. That seems to me to be what President Macron would say is a bit naive. I think it was a mistake that European EV subsidies built China's electric vehicle industry. China never allowed European-made cars to qualify for its EV subsidies. Buy European is allowed in government procurement. I think it should be allowed in subsidized government procurement when checks are handed out to consumers. I also think it's much better than having weird national regulations like the French put together, which turned out to be by French rather than by Europe. Explicit, sometimes better than implicit. And I hold on, maybe cling irrationally to the hope that one day the US and Europe could come together and have a program whereby European-made cars would qualify for American EV subsidies, which we will not have for 4 years, but maybe we'll have in 5. And American-made cars, if there are any EVs, would qualify for European subsidies. Third piece of advice, don't be American. Don't be fully American. And what I mean by that is there is sometimes a little bit too much of Silicon Valley, Wall Street envy, a sense that Europe's future is to try to become the most profitable parts of the US economy, that you need to emulate the venture capital complex to a very high degree. Now, fine to try to catch up, fine to try to break up monopolies. But the US economy has been much better at generating profits and turning founders into multi-billionaires who become political complexities than it has been at generating broad-based growth. And I think if you look at the broader spillovers from Apple to the rest of the US economy, you don't find them. There is no Mittelstand in the US that is the supplier base for Apple. That is actually found in China, as a very good new book points out. Capturing the profit alone is, in my view, insufficient. And I think it is certainly insufficient for a world that is fragmenting and where the most likely global order is no global order. It's a series of regional orders. And where strong industrial bases and companies that nurture strong industrial bases in their home region are a critical part of the economy. Capturing the profit is not enough. There is something strange about a world economy where 75% of the world's market cap, in some measures, is captured by US companies. A lot of people look at that with envy, but to paraphrase Bernie Sanders, you could also say it is a bit of a problem. It implies an unbalanced American economy. And I guess my final piece of advice would be that Europe has real strengths, and that I find it surprising that there's not a greater sense of self-confidence here.
Thank you. I have prepared many more questions, and I could fill up with many questions which appeared through this podium. I want to ask, we have, I think, 8 more minutes, but one last final question I would like to ask all of you, and this is what you have all mentioned. I mean, pretty much what I get out of this, we have to learn more from China, learn less from the US. I don't know if it's true, you can correct me, but is it really working because what I have mentioned, what you also described was the fiscal problems we have. We have now two superpowers, and looking at the key technologies, not of the future, but of the present, where Europeans are obviously lacking behind. And when I see how much money the Chinese government spends on it, invests in it, and then I see how much money the US tech companies are spending on it, on AI and on semiconductors. And then on the same hand, as I mentioned, I see all these countries, Germany, Japan, Canada, Australia, they cannot deal with this because of fiscal problems, they cannot keep up. And is it anyhow possible? And on the same hand, we have the European Union, which is theoretically a huge economy, but on the other hand, so fragmented. Can we really keep up with these two superpowers, with all the scaling you have mentioned, and with all the money from government side or from tech side, or is the European model at the end? Maybe we start with Adam and go this side.
I wanted to hear Servaas on this point.
Very short, 2 sentences each. Sorry, I got the sign.
Well, I mean, I've been writing and thinking a lot recently about the defense sector, and it's hard to think of a more spectacular instance of that problem, really precisely sharpened down, because Europe does not have a defense spending problem, really. It has a defense effectiveness and efficiency problem of a truly spectacular scale. It has 1.3 million people under arms. It has a budget that is far larger than its most immediately threatening neighbor, Russia. And by all intents and purposes, it appears to produce virtually no actual effective military capacity for spending which runs into the hundreds of billions of euros every year and trillions over a decade. And it seems largely to be a result of that fragmentation that you're talking about. So again, it comes back to me, and this isn't a new problem, we've known this for decades. So layered on top of that, there is also a kind of, I think part of the problem, Brad, when you say why are the Europeans not more self-confident, in the same way as Americans realize there's something really very deeply broken, that it's not easy to see how to fix it. There is also in Europe a kind of fatigue with great new ideas, because we've been staring at this defense sector issue for literally decades, and the progress is agonizingly slow, if it present at all.
Well, I would observe that when 10 years ago, China launched the China 2025, we were observing this long-term program as something of the past. We were mentioning the fact that the development planning was something more obscure in our departments in Europe. And but who was studying the China 2025 program was seeing not only money, a lot of money, a lot of subsidies. The recent OECD report, MAGIC database, show exactly where the money went, in which sectors, and subsidies went in which sectors, and which kind of companies had money from the Chinese government. But the point was not only money, was a direction of change. And what is missing in Europe, in Germany, but I prefer the perspective of Europe, what is missing is exactly the direction. Anytime we try to think that we have a direction, think of the Green Deal. So, oh, wow, we are not in time, but we can catch up the issue at least. We immediately stopped any thinking of what were the implications of that goal. So the point is, again, not only money, but the direction of change. And I'm really worried, and this was a part of the Draghi reports for the European competitive future. The idea that in any event, Europe has a problem with the defense. So on balance, you can say, well, if we invest in the defense, at least we have a driver for supporting part of the manufacturing and services of our economy. But this is dramatic. In any sense, if I think that we have to fill that gap, okay, we have to fill that gap, but it's not enough. And if we think of the automotive sector, we have to think that a strategy is not only climate change. A strategy is the kind of mobility, the kind of cars that should be produced. And either the European Commission set a model, a direction for those decisions, or the companies will produce larger and larger cars that needs bigger and bigger batteries of an incredible amount of raw materials and so on. So I think that either we have a direction and then we find the money, or if we think that the problem of this money is not a solution of our problems now.
Dalia, one sentence, please.
One sentence.
Or two.
You posed such a big question that I cannot answer that big question. But what I wanted to say is that in the past, Germany was saved from the China shock, not only because of the boom in exports to China, but it also was saved by having an Eastern European shock. The shock from Eastern Europe, but this shock was different. It was a shock which we call, as economists, an intra-industry shock, which doesn't have these distributional effects as the inter-industry shock that China has posed for some of the countries. So what happened is Germany had this big export expansion to Eastern Europe, and at the same time, the imports from China replaced the imports from other Southern European countries. So the first China shock was felt in Southern Europe, like Turkey, Spain, Portugal, Italy, because they now had all these they couldn't export anymore to Germany because China was exporting to Germany. So, but this is not going to be in the future. Now, this is not going to solve Germany's problem. But I do believe exactly what you said. I think that the defense sector, building up the defense sector, might be a solution for Germany to replace some of the losses that it has suffered in the machinery sector and in the car sector.
Okay. 2 sentences each.
Germany does not lack money. Europe does not lack money. Europe could spend on the private side, could invest less in financing US takeover activity, put less of its pension money in private credit and junk bonds, invest more in building out Europe's own infrastructure and manufacturing capabilities. Europe's public sector is in a far stronger fiscal position than that of the United States. And the uniqueness of this moment, which actually gives me hope and optimism about Europe, is that those parts of Europe that are most exposed to the shocks coming from Russia in all of their forms and to the China shock are the parts of Europe that have the most fiscal capacity. My advice is use it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with Brad. If you look at the public debt to GDP ratio in Europe, in the Eurozone, it's like roughly 83%. In 2024, in the US, it's 124%. In China, it's 250% plus. In Japan, it's probably also 225%. So, I mean, if you just look at the data, you can say, look, we have fiscal space. In addition to the fact that we may have fiscal space, I do think that we also have two hidden instruments or two hidden options. One is, okay, I mean, we can actually make use of the Eurozone. We can issue common debt. Yeah, I mean, we are not really doing it, but we can do it. And that would be, and then the other secret weapon that we have, and it is a very secret weapon, actually it's a topic that we cannot, like Voldemort, we cannot mention his name. Taxation, yes. I mean, we can actually increase taxes and we can then spend. And if we spend wisely, government spending will have multiplier effects. Actually, it will lead to growth and it will lead to infrastructure. It will crowd in private spending. So it is not even clear that the debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratio, has to go up if we really do something in terms of spending that is useful. Anyway, it's not simple. That's not the point. But it's also not a problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Money is there. It's lack of vision. That's what we're here for. Rethinking economy. Thank you very much for your inputs. And yes.